Good evening. My name is Barbara Grosh, and I'd like to welcome you to our forum tonight. I have some special guests to introduce. Before that, I guess I'm supposed to say that I'm president of the local League of Women Voters. We're a nonpartisan membership grassroots organization. Our job is helping people be informed voters, and that means helping them register and get ready to vote and know who they want to vote for and what's on their ballots and be informed about issues that come up, the whole 9 yards. So I have been hearing about this anti-racist education curriculum project for a couple of years, and I thought, oh yeah, we should learn more about that sometime. And in the time between when I had those thoughts and today, we've had crazy stuff happening all over the country about curriculum. So it's more topical than ever. Some things get less topical as time goes on, but this one got more topical. So I'm really glad to introduce you both. So I know more about Shane, so I'm going to start with him. And Shane, maybe you can introduce Kesha. So Shane is a 4th grade teacher in the Henrietta schools. And the way he got interested in this topic was I don't know if it was Black History Month or whenever you were teaching about the civil rights movement, and your student said, well, what happened around here? And he had to say he didn't know. And so he started finding out. And that led to him developing curriculum first for himself, and then it got bigger and bigger. And so I'll stop there because you'll tell us all about it. And why don't you go ahead and unmute and introduce Kesha. So you guys are welcome to talk for 30 or 40 minutes if you want. I'm going to turn my camera off. When you get to the end of your presentation, I'll come back on and help moderate questions from the audience. People can put questions into the Q&A. We encourage you to use the Q&A, and also notice that we have the closed captions set up. So if anyone needs to see the transcript, you can click on your live transcript CC button down there on the bottom of your screen. This is being recorded and it will be on our website soonish. So welcome Shane, welcome Kesha, and I'm going to sign off right now.
Barbara, it is such an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for the incredibly important work you do in our community with educating us and helping us be engaged citizens and participate in civic action to draw our own conclusions about who to vote for and make educated and smart decisions. I think that's incredibly in line with our work at the Antiracist Curriculum Project hosted by Pat Stone. Like Barbara said, I'm Shane Wiegand. I teach 4th grade in West Henrietta. This year I'm on a leave of absence to co-lead this project, thanks to the generosity of many local funders. I'm also here because I serve on the boards of City Roots Community Land Trust and Connected Communities, where we do a lot of work around housing justice. I live in the Beechwood neighborhood, and I'm also an adjunct instructor over at the University of Rochester in the neurology department, although I don't know anything about neurology, but I do know a lot about equity and local history. And do a lot of work with them around that. And so that's some of the stuff that I've been doing around the community. We've been doing a lot of curriculum and writing. We're actually going to put you to work today. But before I do that, I'll turn it over to Kesha, who is just incredible. She's an amazing local educator, RCSD teacher formerly, and all good things around education and doing what's best for kids. But I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself. And then we're going to invite you to participate in some of the actual lessons we've been doing with thousands of kids across the county.
Hey there, everyone. Such an honor to be here tonight. Again, my name is Kesha James. I have been an educator in the Rochester City School District for the last 14 years, teaching elementary and middle school, did a little instructional coaching as well. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so I've had the unique experience of blending mental health and education together, not only in my classroom, but also helping teachers and different stakeholders in the community really understand the impacts of mental health on individuals, and also thinking about, on ourselves. I co-lead the Antiracist Curriculum Project with Shane, which is why I'm here tonight. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Medaille College in Buffalo, where I work with graduate level marriage and family therapists and really focusing on how to support diverse clients. And so really excited to kind of dig in with you all tonight and have you experience some of the curriculum that we've created.
I just want to start off with our mission. Our team is committed to facilitating the adoption of the history of structural racism and resistance. We have curriculum that our team that you can see right here, an amazing diverse team of teachers and professors from all across our area. We support students and educators in the co-creation, implementation, evaluation of our curriculum. And we want to make sure that everything we do is free. All of our curriculum and professional development is free. It is open source. And it's stuff that school districts can adapt and change to best meet the needs of their schools and districts. And finally, we want to engage students and help students become leaders, draw their own conclusions about what this means, and make decisions inspired by context and history about how they want to engage themselves in civic action, in voting, to what's happening at their town board meeting, to the state, to the national level. We also don't have explicit political opinions, nor does our curriculum espouse them. Instead, it gives primary sources, a model for how to interpret and think through them, and restorative practice to help us guide that thinking. And our hope is just that all kids across our county will learn our local history, particularly as it relates to racist policy and resistance in Rochester. And the work really began, like Barbara was sharing, was when actually on Martin Luther King week, about 9 years ago or so, one of my fourth graders in Henrietta said, "Mr. Wiegand, did Martin Luther King ever come here?" And I was like, "I have no idea. I grew up in Webster. I never learned about that." And they were like, "Well, did we have civil rights here or problems like that?" And I was like, I'm a little embarrassed, but I have no idea. I didn't learn about it. And I reflected and I said, I never had a Black teacher growing up in Webster schools. And I maybe sat by 3 or 4 Black students in my time there. I don't really recall anything other than civil rights maybe in the South or Rosa Parks kind of conversation. That's a really good question. And I was a history major. My master's from Geneseo was in multicultural education. I was like, I can look into this. And as I started looking into it, I started meeting amazing local heroes and activists like Dr. Walter Cooper, who integrated the town of Henrietta in 1958, or Dr. Alice Young, who fought the Ku Klux Klan, who was the first Black principal in Monroe County, helped found at Monroe Community College. I started meeting youth who, like these youth on the right at Teen Empowerment, who were activists in our community. And that really ended up actually leading me to meet Kesha, because the youth, about 30 of them at Teen Empowerment, had learned this history that we're going to share with you today around slavery in New York State and redlining and local civil rights. And they said, "Why aren't we learning this at school?" And I was like, "I don't know." Well, if you want to learn it, who can we talk to? And they figured out they should talk to the social studies director at our CSD. And they did. And that led to a training and over 200 teachers going through just a volunteer pilot. And Kesha was one of those teachers. And it led to her eventually joining me and co-leading the project and us raising some funds to be able to do this work full time and offer it free of charge and open source for the community. And I'll just turn it over to Kesha to talk a little more though about our board that supervises us and where some of our funding comes from. And then we're going to dig right into some curriculum.
So as you can see, all of our work is overseen by an advisory board from past and to present local civil rights leaders to New York State regents to all of the deans at the local colleges of ed. So we've been able to cultivate these relationships and really make sure that this curriculum isn't just in the hands of a select few educators in Monroe County, but truly is a community experience where multiple stakeholders have an opportunity to look through, to give feedback, to help choose sources, and really making sure that this isn't just a small group of educators that want to push this work forward, but it is something that the community values and sees the importance of. And really, our hope is to really create systemic change. And we know that this is something that we need to get as many people on board as possible to really support this important work. And all of our work is free and open source, and we're able to do this. Shane and I are actually on leave from teaching and doing this work full time based on the generous funding from most of the local funders in Monroe County. Really, some of them who've made some of their money from actual redlining, which we're going to get into a little bit today, and just a way for them to kind of own their truth and their history, and really kind of pay back the community.
I want to jump in with some group norms. With all of our units, what we want to do is create safe spaces for students to be able to talk about current events, about history in their community, about difficult topics. And I don't know about you, but in my family, sometimes Thanksgiving or big family dinners can be a little tense and uncomfortable. People have strong feelings, and we often don't know how to have those conversations well or with safety. And what we want to teach is something different in our classrooms, that we can disagree, we can come to different conclusions, we can have different ideas about the civic actions we want to take, but we can learn how to have safe conversations about these hard topics. And so we use something called restorative practices. These are endorsed by New York State in the Culturally Responsive Framework, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But they're also just rules for how to have conversations. And we'd like to have these rules for our conversation tonight. I know you'll be able to share in the chat or in the Q&A, but what we'd like to do is introduce you to a few group norms, and then we're going to actually walk you through some of our curriculum. Because what our hope is that as you look at our curriculum, we hope that you learn something about our local history, that you learn something about where you live, and about how we can have these conversations, have them in a way that's not indoctrination, it's not critical race theory or some spooky thing, but that's an honest look at local history that empowers students to make their own decisions about it. So to have this conversation, we'd like to invite you to agree to these norms. Speak your truth, stay engaged, expect to be a little uncomfortable. We're going to talk about racism. Be aware of your intent and own the impact of your words. You know, if we say the wrong thing, we want to learn from that. But we want to also assume we're here with good intentions. Accept and accept non-closure. We're not going to figure everything out tonight. We might not have an answer to every question, but we're going to do our best. Be curious, maintain that learner stance. Respond to yourself and others with gentle compassion and curiosity. Just stay curious. If already your hackles are raised a little, or you're like, whoa, this is something else. I don't know. Maybe I made a mistake coming to this League of Women's Voters meeting. Take a deep breath, be curious, and hear us out and enjoy some learning that kids are doing across our county. And then finally, what we say here stays here in some of the discussion. And let's just speak our first draft, which means, you know, sometimes we say something and then we realize, actually, maybe there's a better way I can say that. And it's okay to do it. So if you're good with that, if folks in the chat could just put a thumbs up or I agree to these group norms. And I think people can share in the chat. Oh, yep. They can. So if you just go ahead and share in the chat that you agree to follow these norms, that would be great. And if you have an issue, please let us know. My fourth graders often have an issue with one of these group norms. It's different every time, and they want to make sure they understand it. And we'll pause and think it through or amend it a little bit so they make sure they feel safe having this kind of conversation. That looks like we all agree. I really appreciate that and want to invite you to hold us and one another accountable during this conversation. This is exactly what we're doing with kids across the county with this work.
All right. So one of the things that I just want to point out is this quote by James Baldwin that says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And oftentimes when we have these really difficult conversations, there's this really uncomfortable feeling that starts to come up for folks. And that's called cognitive dissonance. And so what I want to do is just kind of explain what that is to you all tonight. And so cognitive dissonance is that really uncomfortable feeling that happens when we get new information in that contradicts what we know and believe to be true. And especially if that information contradicts what we know and believe to be true about ourselves, our personal values, or our morals. Oftentimes this feeling just starts to feel super uncomfortable, and your brain interprets that uncomfortable feeling as a threat. And so it kicks into action and does exactly what it's designed to do, which is protect you. And so oftentimes when we feel that really uncomfortable feeling, our brain will respond in one of a few ways. Sometimes we will deny the information, we might ignore it, we may rationalize it, or sometimes we may want to become defensive of it and feel like it's a personal attack. So if any of those feelings come up today, I just want you to notice it. It's completely normal. Don't start to beat yourself up or shame or blame or guilt, because that's not the purpose of this at all. It's just to be curious. I would definitely offer the suggestion of taking a deep breath if you have some big feelings that are coming up. Maybe jot down what you're feeling and really kind of pay attention to it later on and say, why was it that one slide really bothered me? Or what was it about this? And again, just start to question and become a little bit curious, because that's how we all will grow internally.
So I want all of you to remember your fourth grade teacher. Mine was Mrs. McCormick at Plank North Elementary School. She was the best. She read in all the funny voices during read aloud time. I absolutely loved her. And I want you to kind of picture yours. Picture some of your learning in elementary school. And we're going to show you some of the shifts and the way some things have sort of changed. And we're going to walk you through one of our units, but we're not going to tell you right away what it is. So what we want you to do is pretend you're a fourth grader, although you can be a grown-up too. Open up the chat, and we're going to ask you to share what you notice and wonder and infer about an image. It's a mystery image or a mystery source that we call it. But we're going to work together as a group to try to figure out what this is, and then what conclusions or things we might be able to learn from it, which will then kick off this first part of our learning together. And this is exactly what we do with 4th and 7th graders. That's our only hint that we'll give you about this. So again, get your chats open, get ready to share what you notice, wonder, infer. And I want to encourage you, just like our 4th graders, be brave and take a risk. You might be wrong, but that's okay. We hope to frustrate you and have a little bit of fun. So you ready?
Here we go. All right, so what do you notice? What do you wonder?
There's no wrong answer either.
Looks like a fresco painting.
Oh boy.
Yeah, okay. Some geometrical shapes.
See a balloon. Oh yeah, see a balloon maybe. Is there a figure there? Maybe draped in cloth?
Is that an apple on a pedestal or a stone or a throne?
Christine sees a building. Maybe it's a little piece of something bigger.
Maybe some text. It's not necessarily Latin. Okay.
Or he's wondering a mosque maybe, or a church.
Maybe a fountain or some building with some writing.
Oh, I like that inference, fountain. And feel free to share shapes, colors. Imagine, there's no right or wrong answer what you can share. Let's take a look at one more part of this larger image. What do we notice or wonder now? Feet. 2 of them maybe. Someone with dark skin.
Bare feet.
Black feet. Maybe someone forgot their shoes. Pillow. Oh, maybe some robes.
A person sitting on the throne.
Tell you at this point, when I do this with 4th graders, they're bouncing up and down in their chairs. It's getting wiggly in that space. They're like, they've got to figure this out. It's super fun. Oh, a little tile on the top of a building, maybe. All right, let's look at a little bit more of the image. What do we notice and wonder now? Maybe some Latin text.
The edge of a crown, maybe a scepter. Could it be a king's crown? Royalty, maybe. It's that language.
Oh, maybe a goblet. Maybe an arm. A culture different than yours.
Is that a pot of red paint there in the corner?
Kathy, it does look like that. You're right. Maybe that is a pot of red paint. But I'm not telling you if you're right or not.
What do these lines mean? What do they represent?
Maybe male or female. Great wonder. Notice right off the bat, we're trying to teach kids to ask questions, to look closely, to think about things from different perspectives, to be curious. Well, let's take a look at the final piece. What do you notice and wonder now? Mark's wondering what's going on with these red lines.
And if any inferences are starting to come up for you as well, think about that. Is it a king looking at a globe? What's in their hand? Looks kind of important. Kathy said, oh, it's a person for sure. Is it ancient African culture? Is this bearded man holding a coin or an orb or a ball?
Maybe a scientist. Yeah. All right, who's ready for the whole thing, but still not the name. We are going to give you a hint though. This is something from Africa. So look at this image. What do you notice and wonder? But also, what might you infer from this about the continent of Africa? Got an inference that this might be Mansa Musa. You're rich, from Mali, maybe? Got some sharp students in the room, making some good inferences.
A ruler or a king.
This person looks like they know what they're doing and they're in charge, you know, they're bigger than everything.
All right, so then after we show the full image, we would show students, and again, connecting it to New York State. So this is the beginning of our enslavement unit for New York State. Just showing them that this is Mansa Musa, who ran the Mali Empire, which was 9 times larger than New York State is today. We'd give them a little bit more background knowledge, and then they'd watch this short video to again, get a little bit more understanding and starting to pique their interest with that zoom in. We call that a zoom in, zoom out strategy. So again, gets them thinking about it. And in this unit that we're giving you a quick little preview to, we knew that it was very important to start on day 1 with Africa. Even though we are talking about enslavement in New York State, we know that Black history doesn't start with enslavement. It starts in Africa. And so we were very intentional in the group that worked on this to really make sure that we don't mention the word enslavement until day 2. But really starting to have students start to question or maybe challenge their initial thoughts of Africa. So after they do this activity, this zoom in, zoom out, the next thing we would have them do is go and do a 3-2-1 partner activity. We would show them these really rich images from all over Africa where they do some notices, some wonders, and then they create some inferences as well as they look through these images and worked with a partner to analyze these. So we'll show them images, from the high Atlas Mountains, it's showing them, these dye pits, beautiful, again, cultural pieces that maybe students don't think about. Because I know when I learned about Africa, I was very stereotypical on the things that I learned and I was taught when I was in school. Different structures again, like sculptures and different artistry, medieval African cities, and then even current cities as well. Again, starting to get them to think about, what do you notice? What do you wonder? What can you infer? We ask the question of, what do you think about Africa prior to showing them all these images? And then we ask them again at the end, well, now that you've seen these, now that we've talked about these different regions and areas, what do you think about Africa now? What's shifted and what's changed for you?
So often our Black students are taught their history begins with enslavement, when in fact it begins with royalty, with art, with culture, with architecture, with rich cultural diversity, multiple languages, and this massive, beautiful continent that, like all places, is complicated and complex. And that's the narrative we want kids to start maybe thinking about before we dig into this kind of stuff around American history. This first sort of peek. So we're going to dive in and show you a little bit, and one, say thank you for participating with us in that activity. And hopefully you enjoyed some of those images and that chance to be a fourth grader again. But right from the beginning, inviting kids to draw their own conclusions, to notice and wonder and participate in inquiry is a central part of our model. And to do it in a way that's safe, that's restorative, and teaches kids how to engage in a culturally responsive and empowering way. And so the next piece of our unit is to dig into this inquiry question. And we're going to show you a few slices of some of our different units, including our units on redlining and local civil rights, which we'll show you in a little bit. But first, we want to show you one of the units we recently completed, this unit on enslavement. And so our big question in this unit that Kesha and I don't have an answer to, and that we don't tell the kids there is a right answer to, but instead invite them to make a claim and prove it with evidence from primary sources that we help curate, is how do Black people and their allies resist the horrible conditions of enslavement in New York State? And when we have this conversation, we want to have it in maybe a different way than I was taught or Kesha was taught as a kid, a way that's more culturally responsive, that's person first, and that, like New York State asks in its standards, that we help kids critically examine structures of power. Austin Stewart was enslaved right here in the Rochester area by Sodas and then later Bath. He didn't choose to be enslaved. It was something done to him, right? And so we shift the language from slave to enslaved person, an individual forced to work for no pay and without freedom. And we'll tell you a little more about Austin Stewart later, who's one of Rochester's most famous citizens and freedom seekers. Or how about Daniel Penfield? Here's an example of an enslaver. And I'll turn it over to Kesha to talk a little bit more about him.
So we've shifted the language from master to enslaver because master, usually connotates like a positive thing. You're something that you're really good at, versus enslaver is showing a choice in what these individuals actually did. And so when we share this with students, we give the definition of an individual who buys and sells human beings and forces them to work for no pay. And having those local examples are so important for students because, this is an example of Daniel Penfield, who enslaved African Americans, forced them to work at his mill in the town of Penfield. And this statue actually sits in the town of Penfield right now, where he's glorified. You see the picture of the mill, but there's no indication at all of how that money was created. And that was based off of the work of enslaved Africans. And again, just really showing, this current space and shifting that language to really show the choice and to talk about, that we have this local history right here in New York State.
I do find it a little ironic. This isn't in the curriculum, but just a note for myself that today, according to EdBuild, in 2020, Penfield and Rochester's border is the most segregated school district border by race and class in all 50 United States, right? And this town named for someone who enslaved African people and who is glorified in their town square. Or how about a freedom seeker, shifting from runaway, which implies doing something wrong, to a freedom seeker who's doing something right. Here's Thomas James, someone who bravely risked his life to escape from enslavement. He actually was enslaved in Canisteo, New York, and he escaped on the freshly built Erie Canal, made his way up to Canada, learned to read, kind of came back down to Rochester when he felt like it was safe, where he started the first Black church, the AME Zion. It still stands over on Favor Street today. He operated a station on the Underground Railroad, just a hero of Rochester's history and New York history. But growing up, I never learned about. In fact, I don't know about you, but I never learned that slavery happened in New York State. This was big new learning for me as an adult. And it's new learning for most of our kids. And what we want to do with them is, before we take a real deep dive into primary sources and first-person accounts that we've adapted for them, we want them to just take a look at a bunch of different little sources and start to think about that inquiry question. What was slavery like in New York State? How did people respond? And how did people resist? We would start with this amazing infographic that shows just, it's a really powerful, I wouldn't even say amazing, I'd just say powerful is probably the appropriate word, or just a little bit terrifying, but it documents every single voyage over 315 years on that middle passage of millions of lives and over 20,000 ships, documenting every single one. You can click on them, read the manifest, see how many men, women, as well as children were on each of these boats. You'll see that these boats are coming to places like New York State. And this is sort of how we kick off the unit, inviting kids and teachers in our trainings to notice and wonder, what's happening here? What does this say about what enslavement was like? And seeing this global thing that's happening. So we kind of start there, give them a chance to see some of that that's going on, and then invite them to do a gallery walk. And a gallery walk is this really cool teaching thing where you put up pictures around the room and kids put sticky notes on them, sharing notices and wonders, and then their conclusions from each image about what might this tell us about enslavement in New York State. We have this really cool gallery walk, and hold on, let me open this thing up for you. We did a training, a statewide training for teachers today, and you can kind of see the way they responded to some of these images. Like here's one of the Underground Railroad. And a lot of people were shocked that the Underground Railroad went south to Mexico and the islands, as well as to Canada. And of course, right through Rochester.
Or you see some other folks really thinking about, learning about Reverend Thomas James and this, him creating the first Black church, or the first church in Rochester, AME Zion, that supported Black folks, and also created the first school for Black children because they weren't allowed to go to school with white children. And, folks realizing, that they didn't learn about slavery or enslavement in the North. Just like I did, I learned that enslavement happened in the South, that we were quote unquote better up here. And just how shocking it was to see that, right in our backyard, people here were enslaved.
And notice how kids can respond to each other's comments, help answer each other's questions, even make connections in this learning. This isn't a lecture, this isn't a video. It's inviting them to consider, or here's Sojourner Truth, enslaved in Hurley, New York, just south of Albany. When she was 28 years old, she was enslaved for over 28 years. She had her 10-year-old son sold out from under her. She was sold herself for $100 for some sheep. And later, we're going to actually share more of her story of how she fought to get her son back. But again, showing you didn't have control of your children. People as property, sold for a sheep or $100 right here in New York.
Or even looking at, Harriet Tubman, and really thinking about, we've heard a lot about her, but, her being in Auburn, New York, and the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years.
Or the New York State Senate. I was shocked when we were starting to uncover this, that more than half of New York State senators in 1790 and 1800, they were enslavers, people who owned human beings. And that did not disqualify them, according to the electorate, as a reason not to vote for them to be in charge of the state. And in fact, it led to the passage of laws that systematically allowed for enslavement in New York. Slavery was allowed until 1827. The white men in charge could have voted to end it, but instead passed a gradual Emancipation Act that didn't end slavery for almost 30 years after they passed that law.
Or even the fact that our town or our city, Rochester, was named after Nathaniel Rochester, who was also an enslaver. Something that was new information for lots of folks. Or even thinking about our county, being named after James Monroe, who enslaved over 250 persons in his lifetime.
Or even helping them see some of the numbers. how many people were enslaved, how this kind of went up and down over time in New York State, or helping them see that in every time and place, African Americans who were enslaved always fought back and resisted. Some like Harriet Tubman won, other folks did not, like here in 1712 in New York City, a revolt where the 20 people who helped lead this uprising against their enslavers, they were punished. It was not good. But we want kids to see that even though sometimes they didn't win and many times didn't, people always fought back and fought for their freedom. This was not something that was willingly accepted by enslaved people or their choice.
So we're going to show you the next part, which is a common source. So what we have students do, this would be the next day. They're going to read autobiographical information from Sojourner Truth and Austin Stewart. But what we did was we took the Stanford History Education Group's model and really pared down this 1800 really difficult to read language to fourth grade students, so a fourth grade reading level. And so should I read it to them?
Yeah, go for it. And then in the chat, while Kesha reads, share your notices and wonders and conclusions that you might draw from her first-person account as told to Olive Gilbert about what it was like for her to be enslaved. So feel free to open up that chat and share as Kesha reads.
One of Sojourner Truth's earliest memories was moving into a new home with her enslaver. The basement under the hotel was where the enslaved lived. This basement was so disgusting that Sojourner could not get this memory out of her head. The basement was cold and dark with just a few beams of light coming through a few small windows. Constantly being wet and breathing in unclean air was chilling and unhealthy. Her body trembles every time she thinks back to those memories and revisits the basement in her mind. Before Sojourner Truth left her old enslaver, he sold her young son, who was only 5 years old. He was sold to a doctor who planned on taking him from New York City to England. The doctor thought he was too small to work, so he was passed to several other enslavers before he ended up with a wealthy enslaver in Alabama. Sojourner Truth was devastated and heartbroken at losing her son. She called on Mrs. Gedney, the mother of the enslaver that sold her son, to help. Sojourner cried out for help to be reunited with her son. Mrs. Gedney laughed at Sojourner, saying she would never see her son again. Sojourner paid a lawyer to take the enslaver to court and help her get her son back. She didn't give up, and they won. The judge ordered that Sojourner's son be returned to her.
Feel free to open up your chat. Feel free to read a little bit and share what words stick out to you. What do you notice about Sojourner's story? What does it tell us about what slavery was like in New York State? Yeah, what questions are coming up? Like, how long did it take for her to be reunited? How'd she get her freedom? I know it was several years before she got her son back, but to get her freedom, it wasn't until 1827 when emancipation happened. What other questions or wonders, conclusions might you draw?
How did she not give up? It's devastating.
Some pretty incredible courage happening here. Great question. On what basis did a court rule that her son should be returned? Well, part of the Gradual Emancipation Act said that an enslaver in New York could not sell someone across state lines. And so Sojourner's enslaver sold her son across state lines down south. And that was against New York state law. And she became the first person of color, a woman of color, to ever win a lawsuit in the United States here in New York. And she was able to persuade that lawyer to help her do it.
So how did she have the money? How did she end up getting that money? Just thinking about that inhumane treatment.
Yep. Oftentimes, folks who are enslaved would, outside of their forced no pay workday, sometimes were allowed to do piecemeal type work or work outside of their day on top of the enslaved work, and could sometimes earn a little bit of extra money. There were possibilities depending on who the enslaver was. I think it's important that inhumane treatment, as well as what it said about persistence. She really is so powerful. It's important to note too how she found a lawyer who was white, was because a lot of people in New York State knew, or I think it's hard for me to understand how someone doesn't know slavery is wrong, but there were many who were allies and were working for abolition, like this lawyer. So with kids, we'd invite them to read Sojourner's story and then read it a second time and do the same thing with Austin Stewart. We don't have time to read his whole story, but again, he was enslaved here right by Rochester, eventually escaped up across Canandaigua Lake with his friend Millie, another enslaved person, who actually, she was the one that gave him the courage to make that escape. And he made his way up through the woods to Canandaigua. And then eventually he was able to get his freedom. And the first thing he did was learn to read. Later, he opened up a first Black-owned business in Rochester, the first school for Black children anywhere in our area. His Rochester City School District, the city council had actually made a policy that Black children could not attend a school in Rochester. So he created his own with his friend Thomas James. So pretty incredible stories, and we'll share this with you at the end so you can read them closer and even see their whole autobiographies. But then we invite students to think critically, because again, our curriculum is not about a lecture. It's not about telling kids what happened. It's about giving them the tools to determine for themselves. And so we have these 4 primary source superheroes that you'll see on the top left. We have Captain Context, the Credible Hulk, Mr. E, get it, mystery, and then the connector or main idea master. And the first one is Mr. E, who asks, what's the mystery or question or purpose? And whose voice might be missing from this story? Because maybe there are missing voices here. We want kids to think about that. We don't want them to just trust a text just because the teacher gave it to them. We want them to think critically about it. Or when and where was this artifact created and written? What do we know about this time and place? He wrote this in 1857 after he was enslaved, right before the Civil War. He's an abolitionist. He's trying to get enslavement to end in the South. That might be part of his purpose. What's the main idea of this document? Clearly that he thinks enslavement is bad, bad enough to escape. And then finally, is it credible, reliable? Is this believable? Why or why not? It's okay if a student says no, as long as they can back that up with some solid evidence and reasoning. That is okay in the classrooms. We look at these sources. We want kids to ask these questions about these texts and the other texts that we share. The next thing that we do is we go into a round of Jigsaw Sources. Kids have the chance to each learn a little bit more about what enslavement was like and the ways Black people and their allies resisted, like digging in more deeply to the Underground Railroad, learning it wasn't an actual railroad, learning about Harriet Tubman and her role in the Rochester area, Austin Stewart and his role on the Underground Railroad. They have a chance to learn deeper about Thomas James, hear more of his story, particularly about what it was like to be enslaved by George Hess in Canisteo, and what it was like to escape at night on the newly dug Erie Canal and start a church in Rochester and see the actual picture of that church with its escape tunnel underneath the pulpit, or read newspapers from the 1700s where white enslavers would publish advertisements like this one for a man named Prince who escaped. And what does that say? It shows that folks resisted, they ran away, and it shows how valuable they were to their enslavers. This guy's going to pay $800 to whoever can return this freedom seeker to his enslaver, right? And helping kids make this connection that wealth and money is a direct tie to enslavement and motivation behind it. We're finally about abolition, thinking about what some of those barriers were and the way brave folks like Austin Stewart, who spoke on the day of emancipation at City Hall in Rochester, helped end it. They learn about folks like our governor, DeWitt Clinton, who's famous for Clinton's Ditch or the Erie Canal, but less famous for being someone who actually enslaved several people right here in New York State and voted to not end enslavement right away like he could have.
So what we do to prepare to have safe conversations with students is we set up these group norms. We have what we call restorative circles, where we start to think about, very similar to what we did with you all in the beginning, of, what are the rules that we need to have so that we can feel comfortable, but also have safe and challenging conversation as well. We know that this is really hard history to learn, but it's also important to teach our students real history so that they know the truth. And so we start with these circle agreements with students, and then going into our first round of questions, which would be, having them think about, well, what did you learn about enslavement in New York State? You can go to the next slide, Shane. And really thinking about that inquiry question of how have Black people and their allies resisted. So again, doing this in a restorative, safe way, where we've learned all of this information over a 5-day period. And now let's really start to think about, what have we learned? And then also another thing we want to do with students is in that second round is checking in with them and saying, okay, well, what are some feelings that are coming up for you? Learning about enslavement is tough, and what questions do you still have? We use this tool called the zones of regulation, where we give students the opportunity to share what zone are they in. Are they, some of them, in the green zone? Are they in the yellow zone? Are they in the red zone? Are some of them, feeling sad about this, or feeling upset, or just still having questions because they don't understand? It's so important to create space for feelings to come up here, because this is a lot of information and it can feel, really heavy, but it's also, again, it's important so that we understand true history. And we know that, we don't continue this misconception, like many of us were probably taught that, enslavement happened in the South, and, things were better up here, and we really didn't have these kind of policies or problems as well. And then the last thing that we do is we invite students to really think about what they learned about Sojourner Truth and Austin Stewart, how they took civic action. And then we invite them to start to think about, what are the problems that you see in your school or in your community? How can we use what Truth and Stewart did to really think about how we can address some big problems that we're seeing? Creating this, civic action project, and really having them drive that, not teachers sitting here and saying, this is what we need to do, or these are the problems. It's, what do you see? What do you think?
Here's an example of 3 of my students in Henrietta, who, after learning about brave people like Sojourner Truth and more modern folks like Dr. Alice Holloway Young, they actually got upset about some of the systemic racism that they observed in their school, and they challenged it. Here they are meeting with a principal about hiring, and how come there were 0 Black teachers at our elementary school in Henrietta. They thought that was wrong, and they actually won and got a policy changed in our school, using the examples of people who look like them from their community, who over hundreds of years have always taken action to fight against what they believe is wrong. We know, though, that there's other stories being taught across our county. Some of you may have seen these worksheets from school districts all across the county that use some more harmful language, that kind of explicitly have right answers around, like, saying that Black people chose to be enslaved, things like that, kind of minimizing how bad enslavement was. And we want kids to think, whose voices are missing? We don't show these worksheets to kids, but we do with teachers. And we want them to look at these examples that were on the news that are very similar to how I know me and Kesha were taught growing up about enslavement. And we invite teachers in our training, after they go through this experience over 3 hours, we invite them to think, how is this learning experience about enslavement? How is it different from how you learned about enslavement growing up? And we'd like just to take 1 minute, open up the chat, and go ahead and share what was something different about this, maybe, than how you learned about enslavement growing up. Or what about what we just showed might have worked? Or what questions do you still have? And then we're going to show you what we do with local civil rights. So take a minute to share in the chat, and we'll move on. Yep, the primary source documents. And 4th graders all across New York State, it's part of the standards to use primary sources. Nicole noticing incorporating the zones, helping kids share their feelings and think about where they're at. Really good question from Reverend Cunningham about if a student is visually uncomfortable, what do we do? I've had that happen before. And we stop the lesson and we ask questions and give the student a chance to take a break or go for a quick walk, check in with them afterwards to talk about what we can do tomorrow to make them feel more comfortable. And at the same time, we also say there's hard things in the world, and they really happened. And it's really important we learn about them. And it was really hard for those people then too. And I'm here to support you, and you're not alone in learning about this. And I've never had a time where a kid doesn't want to stick with it and keep learning some of this stuff. I really appreciate Lori sharing in the chat. That never taught that slavery was about in the North, not just the South, or that Black history started in Africa, or those kinds of examples. Sue echoing that comment. Some folks mentioning they didn't learn about this in elementary school. New York State for decades has made that part of the standards, and it still often isn't taught because teachers are a little uncomfortable. Nicole remembering being lectured instead of having a restorative inquiry space to learn. Is there discussion after to discuss Jim Crow? There absolutely is, Gaynell, and we're going to talk about Jim Crow in just a minute. Or even the riots, or the rebellion of 1964, or that history about Africa. Yeah. Integration didn't really come to our schools until the 60s, and it's still not fully here. Well, thank you so much for that reflection and sharing a little bit about your experiences. Really want to just draw your attention to some of this work and to some of our model and the different ways we check in with kids verbally and non-verbally, like with fingers or comments or Google Forms, or ways to just give them options to share and check in. And I also want to talk a little bit about our model. Our model for all of our curriculum starts with restorative practices, creating safe spaces, having conversations using restorative circles and practices. Inquiry is the next part, that the focus isn't on lecture, but on primary sources that we have curated with a diverse group of teachers and professors and experts across our area, as well as the community and our board. And then also civic action, everything paired to that people in our community have always fought for justice and equity and for what they believe is right, and that you have the power, even if you're 9, like the kids in my classroom, to make a difference. And all of this is directly supported and encouraged by New York State and its culturally responsive framework, which all schools are implementing and incorporating.
So right here, you'll see our different our inquiry units that we've completed. Shane's going to put this link in the chat. So if you are interested in taking a look at that, we have completed units for grades 4, 8, and 12 that focuses on redlining and resistance that are scaffolded, which means, by each grade level, it gets a little bit more difficult with more information, and everything is developmentally and grade level appropriate. We just recently finished our 5th grade unit on the Latinx or Latino civil rights experience in Rochester. And then what we're showing you right now is an example of our 4th and 7th grade unit, which focuses on enslavement throughout New York State. And again, each one of our units follow the same similar model where they're inquiry based, they're 5-day units, and they can be stretched out a little bit longer depending on the time that a teacher has. But we've gone through and done training, half-day development trainings throughout the county with, almost close to 1,500 teachers, I think, at this point now. And working with all of the local colleges as well.
We also offer some language for students to consider. They don't have to agree. They can work on their own definitions. Again, we're not trying to do indoctrination, but we want to expose kids to language that's being used, like anti-racist, which we refer to as an adjective, just to be more specific and describe an action or a policy. So believing and acting as if racial groups are equals and actively resisting racism. We give kids examples, like here's Howard Coles and his ally Harper Sibley, who are part of the NAACP and used the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper to actually call out Jim Crow policies in Rochester, like the New Deal's redlining that forced Black folks to live in just 2 neighborhoods of downtown Rochester, which we'll talk more about in a second. Or racist adjective, believing is that something is wrong or right, superior or inferior, better or worse about a racial group. Every school in Monroe County participated in racist actions with something called a blackface minstrel show, as did Kodak, its executives, and GM. they proudly published these photographs of blackface minstrel shows in the Democrat and Chronicle and town papers. These went on until 1968. These blackface shows where white folks would dress up, mocking Black people, their intelligence, sending a message of hate. They had main characters like a Black Sambo, a Jim Crow. They were horrific, and yet they were celebrated and deeply ingrained in Rochester's community culture, as well as a key tool in keeping the Rochester school community segregated, white and Black, sending clear messages of who was welcome in each community. We only show these incredibly upsetting images in our 12th grade units, as well as to educators to understand some of the context for what has been taught in Rochester schools and was for decades. And then finally, racist policy. This idea that a law or a system can create or keep inequity between racial groups, like Monroe County's government, who voted to put a whites-only deed on thousands, hundreds of homes across the county that explicitly said no Black person could ever rent or own that home. Kodak did this in Meadowbrook. Even the Gates School District put whites-only deeds underneath its schools to keep them segregated. We dig in and we do a bunch. Go ahead, Kesha.
Now shifting into our redlining unit. So this will be a mixture of our 4th, 8th, and 12th grade redlining unit. We start with a very similar thing we had you do with enslavement in the beginning, where we do the zoom in, zoom out. We ask students to think about these questions. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What do you infer? And Shane's going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly just to show you, we show this racial dot map. We break it up into 4 different quadrants. Students are noticing they see color, they see dots, different colors. They see maybe the streets they live on. And then we show them this image of Rochester, which is very different than the other 3 quadrants they've seen. And they're just like, whoa, there's so much green. I see more color here. And then we show them the full image with the key, showing them that, one dot represents one person, and letting them, really think about, well, where is this? And when do you think this is? Having them guess, is this, in the 60s, is this current? And then we ask them this question, what does this tell us about Greater Rochester in 2010? We don't sit here and say this, but oftentimes the conclusions that students come up with is that Rochester is really segregated. And we always make sure that students, or if we're doing trainings with teachers, that they're the ones that are saying that, because again, this isn't indoctrination. It's about helping people draw their own conclusions.
We also tie in some local statistics from ACT Rochester, who have been great collaborators on this work, Ann Johnson and Simeon Bannister at the Community Foundation. And we invite students to investigate current racial inequity, like home ownership. More than double of the white community own their own home here compared to Black or Hispanic. We invite kids to share wonders and notices and why this might be important, and start to think about what has caused this. Or with our 8th and 12th graders, infant mortality rates almost 3 times higher for Black children, making it to 1 year old in our community. This is happening here. It's hard, but it is the reality of Rochester, incredible racial inequity. And we believe that students need to understand and be a part of creating some of that change if they choose. There's a great question in the chat about the standards and why the grade levels, grades 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 12 have been chosen. And it's because it's those grade levels that New York State has language like this around this kind of history and education. But what we have realized is that often there haven't been enough resources to do this in a way that's empowering and safe for kids. The next thing we do, go ahead, sorry. It's been a long day.
Thing that we do is we go through, again, a common source. So in our enslavement unit, you saw the common source of Austin students, Sojourner's Truth, their autobiographies. And then in our redlining units, we really show this, this map, the redlining map from the 1934 Housing Act. We ask the students, again, what do you notice? What do you wonder? We then show them the key, letting them know that, certain neighborhoods were rated best, certain neighborhoods were rated hazardous, because once we show them the racial dot map, usually the questions are, well, how did we get here? Why are we like this in Rochester? And then we start to, the next day dig into historically, how did we get here?
Showing them this Jim Crow language straight from the federal government about who could get almost $119 billion in mortgage insurance. This is what we show to our 8th grade students. I'm going to read just part of this, and feel free in the chat to share words that stand out to you from this government language in this policy that dictated who could live where and who could receive federal mortgage insurance from the government. All right, feel free to open up your chat and share as I read. Prediction may be made regarding the possibility of a location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to be stable, its necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in value. Again, feel free to share any words or phrases that stick out in the chat. Natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and locations within from adverse influences like lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. High-speed traffic arteries, wide street parkways may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street. Our high school students especially make a connection here to 490 in the inner loop. Finally, accessibility and quality of schools. The social class of parents and children at a school will in many instances have direct bearing. Thus, physical and surroundings of a neighborhood may be favorable and conducive to enjoyable, pleasant living in a location. However, if the children of people living in such an area are compelled to attend school where the majority or a considerable number of pupils represent a far lower level of society or incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and less desirable than if that condition did not exist. People of color were forced into those red line neighborhoods, particularly Rochester's 3rd Ward, the Cornhill, Clarissa Street, and Plymouth Exchange neighborhood, and that Joseph Hudson Clinton or 7th Ward neighborhood, Beechwood area of the city.
And we also want to invite you, if there's any feelings that are coming up as Shane was reading that language, feel free to add that in the chat as well. Again, constantly making space for feelings that come up for educators or students when we work with them.
We invite kids to look at the authors. Whose voice is missing? Oh wait, that's Roosevelt, former governor of New York State. This wasn't someone in the South that made this law. These were Northerners who helped make this law and pass this federal policy, like Senator Wagner. No women are at the table. Remember, women weren't allowed to own a home or buy a home at this period of time. Eugenics is raging in the 1930s. And you can even see that in the area descriptions right here, where students can compare and contrast how the government rated areas to determine hazardous or best, like my neighborhood, Beechwood, that was rated hazardous because it was Italian and Black, even though it was only 2% Black. Whereas Kodak's whites-only Meadowbrook neighborhood with a whites-only deed on every home put there by Kodak and ESL Bank, which was formed to finance that neighborhood. Notice 0% Black businessmen, executives, they get to be called men, whereas up here, they're just labor or workers. So that class distinction, you can see these same things in places like Buffalo or places like Syracuse.
Yep, and having students and teachers being able to look again, seeing, which groups of people were highlighted and how that absolutely determined if a neighborhood was considered hazardous or if it was considered best or greenlined. In every single town, pretty much many towns in New York State, we have these redlining maps and these area descriptors here. And this, for one example, I'm just going to pause here and just read this. So this is Syracuse. They had one section that they just called the Black section. And even just looking at the description and the characteristics of the area, a colored slum section occupied by the lowest type of colored race. Flat land, no favorable influences, no sale for years, probably the oldest area in the city, dwellings in deplorable state. So really thinking about, the language and how explicit it was used, when these maps were created to really designate, where funding was going to go and who was going to live where. And then the next thing that we go into after, and this would be the 4th day of our unit, is we go into what we call these jigsaw sets, where we give students, 4 different examples of really showing Black people and their allies and how they resisted. Because yes, we need to show them, the truth and the laws and the systemic racism that happened, but we always want to pair it with agency and showing that people always stood up. People were empowered, that everyday people like you and me saw these problems in the community and they weren't going to just take it. So in our 4th grade unit, the students will read about the Coopers and how in 1954, when they came to Rochester, they looked at 69 apartments and were denied at every single one, even though both of them had PhDs. Dr. Cooper worked at Kodak, and they were the first family to they worked with the NAACP and the first family to integrate a suburban Rochester of Henrietta.
In 1958,
Mhm.
Or
Or
we
re-
look at Benita and our friends at Puerto Rican Student Union, who didn't have teachers who spoke Spanish. Many of these students didn't speak English, even though they were American citizens from Puerto Rico who migrated to Rochester, and many were forced out of school because there were no teachers for them, and the district had a English-speaking policy. So they protested at board meetings, even did a sit-in at the superintendent's office until they finally won the right to equal and bilingual education in our community. For Judge Davis, Rochester's first Black judge, who prior to that was its second Black lawyer, and in 1958, he tried to buy a house sold by Nothnagel in the 19th Ward on Elmdorf Avenue. He found that on that house, there was a Caucasians only clause in the deed that Nothnagel Realty enforced. And he fought back. He got an ally who was white at the NAACP to buy the house and then kind of illegally sell it to him under the table. And he moved in and refused to leave.
or another example in our 8th grade unit of Dr. Alice Holloway Young and her fight against the KKK in Rochester. She was the first Black principal. She helped to fund MCC and also helped to start the urban suburban program. And, you know, she also had to use an ally at the NAACP to buy the house and sell it back to her under the table. And, you know, her and her husband and child moved in the middle of the night, just with a few things. And by the morning, went to their mailbox and there was a brick in there that said, "You N-words aren't allowed in this neighborhood, signed the KKK of Milbank Street." We pair that with this primary source of showing, you know, over 8,000 Klansmen gathered in East Rochester's what their current football field is, with over 20,000 people in attendance here, where they burned 3 50-foot crosses, really letting people know who was welcomed and who wasn't. And this was proudly displayed, you know, in our local newspaper.
We also highlight policing and some of that history from instances in redline neighborhoods of police brutality, like Rufus Farewell in 1961, and the different strategies the community came up with to challenge and push back. And we invite kids to evaluate those different strategies, from protests like Farewell and the plea that people did after Daniel Prude, to the creation of police advisory boards and other strategies that people of color have always been advocating for in their communities. I invite them to think about, what are the ways that you can take civic action, whether it's volunteering, voting, running for office, advocating for a policy, participating in a protest possibly, that you might choose to try to take action and decide what you want to do. We have tons of jigsaws. These will be shared for you in just a minute in the chat. You got to share them to everyone, Kesha. You just share them to the hosts and panelists.
Oh, okay, I got you.
Kesha will share these so you can take a look through these stories of Rochester history, of how Jim Crow was part of our community and built in, and the way always Black people and their allies have fought back.
And then again, just like with our enslavement unit and with all of our units, we have these restorative circles built in, really making sure that we're integrating social emotional learning into this lesson. This is not something you would just put cold in front of students. We make sure that in our instructions, we help teachers understand that, you know, there are social emotional learning tips and culturally responsive tips for every single day of the unit. Having the circle protocol where we have these agreements of how, just very similar to our group norms, and then taking turns, you know, with students, letting them know they have a right to pass, but also creating space for them to share any thoughts or any feelings that are coming up as we're wrapping up these days and as we're wrapping up these lessons. And so with teachers, we usually will end with these 2 questions, you know, going into breakout rooms, those were in person, having them work in groups of 4, really thinking about, you know, based on all of these primary sources that they looked at, that racial dot map, that common source with that 1934 redlining map, whatever jigsaw source that they decided to read, having them start to say, well, okay, well, what did I used to think and now what am I starting to think? And then what feelings are coming up for me? And then in that second round, we have them start to answer those inquiry questions. How has racism affected New York State? And how have people responded to it? Really drawing from those primary sources as well. You know, I know when I first met Shane and went through this PD, like I, again, used to think that a lot of this happened in the South. I didn't realize that we had this history here in Rochester. So it was so overwhelming and to learn all of this. It was, you know, shocking, but it was also something that kind of lit a fire within me. And I'm just like, I want to help, you know, spread this. And I want people to really know that this exists here.
So as we close, just reviewing, these are the units so far that we've created. We have half-day trainings for all of these units. We'd love to invite folks that if this seems like something you really hope is happening in your town or city, that your children are having a chance to engage in these inquiries, wrestle with these sources, engage in these restorative circles, and ask, what happened here in our community, and what can we do about the current inequities? And what does it mean to be like Dr. Young or Cooper, and make a difference and participate in civic action? We encourage you to reach out to your superintendents, your school boards, let them know about the work that's going on and the ways they can engage. Almost half the local school districts, a little more, we've engaged in some form or another, as well as local colleges. And Kesha and I are running trainings. This is, I think, our 4th training today. It's been a crazy one. And really appreciate this chance to share and would love to hear your questions. But I do want to address a comment in the chat. And I do want to remind us of our group norms, that we're going to speak our own truth. And I want to mention that in the chat, I think Reverend Cunningham, I appreciate you sharing your truth and your conclusion, but also want to acknowledge that is yours. I do think that in that comment, there are some things that I might potentially challenge just a bit, especially that, first of all, the act of moving from the South, where racial terror was the norm, lack of voting rights to the North, was an incredible act of not settling and of resistance and a fight to say, I matter and I deserve to be a full citizen, even if the state won't recognize me that way. And that the majority of folks, as they got to places like Rochester, they fought back in big ways, like a Dr. Alice Young, and in smaller ways for others, by not backing down, by continuing to advocate for better housing. Thousands and thousands participated in huge marches across from Rochester. Always, people of color have not settled. They have fought back and advocated, even though often they've had very little power because of the government. And some of these different pieces might be a conclusion that could be drawn. So just want to invite that for some consideration and direct us back to those norms, but that we also welcome your perspective. Please, in the chat, share your questions, or in the Q&A. We would love to respond. I know we've got about 10 or so minutes left, and would love to answer those questions. I see a question from John. Why don't we have more public support for metropolitan schools, even though we know we have segregated schools? And obviously knowing racism may be behind some of that. John, I want to direct you to Jigsaw 4 in our 12th grade unit, where you can learn about the way African Americans, particularly the Black Student Union at Charlotte High School, fought for integration, some of what worked and some of what didn't. But you'll see a picture of thousands of white folks marching down Main Street in 1971, demanding segregated schools. You'll see a photo of a rally at the War Memorial of almost 4,000 community members demanding segregated schools. And those folks won. The city school district reversed its school integration decision. So there is so much there to dig into. But I still believe it is possible for us to find a better approach to how we're doing schools. And we want our students to be a part of that process, because they're the ones who are most affected, and invite them to think about those solutions.
So I just put a document in the chat. The question was, how do they reach out to us? If you click on that document, you'll see Shane and I's email at the top. So feel free to shoot us an email, and we'd love to set up a time to meet with you.
So I'm going to jump in here and ask
Go
my
ahead, Barb.
questions, because I get to do that. So I gather that the teachers who are coming to your workshops have decided that this is something they want to try, like they're voluntarily stepping up to do this, or that does the school district decide they should do it? How is that working out?
It's usually adopt the curriculum, or they pilot it. Many districts have piloted, some have adopted and put it into their scope and sequence. What usually happens is community members like yourselves have advocated with their school board or principal or superintendent and said, this is really important. It's part of what New York State says should be taught. Are you teaching this? Are you using some of these resources? I think my child should learn this history. And that's led to really positive responses. And many districts, superintendents have invited us in to run trainings for large amounts of their teachers at the different grade levels. And then they've taught it. They've come back and talked about what worked and didn't. We worked on making it better for next year. There have been some places where there's been huge resistance, where people are really upset that this might be making white children feel uncomfortable. And white children being uncomfortable is not worth teaching this history. That's something that I would strongly disagree with. I think white children need to learn this just as much as any other child, which is why I think it's so important that we advocate and ask our school districts what's being taught. School boards determine curriculum. The state determines what should be taught, but the specific curriculum is determined by school boards who are elected. And asking those questions of what those values are and of how they want to make sure these state standards and local stories are taught, I think is incredibly important that we ask questions about and advocate for.
And there has been pushback at some of the school boards, is that correct? There's been some really pretty ugly scenes at some of them, if I read that in the.
There has. I would say though, that the majority of folks, once they see what we're doing, they realize this isn't scary. This is just true history. These are primary sources. We're not telling kids what to think about it. We're trying to do it in a safe way. And even some of our most resistant community members, when they give it a chance and look, are like, oh yeah, my kids should learn this. There is a small contingent in our community who's very loud and I think has really been listened to more than maybe they should in terms of trying to make sure that this local history in our work, and there's other great work that's happening. And I think it really matters that we advocate and speak out.
So I know that the Rochester City Schools have been doing restorative justice and peace circles for a lot of years, but I don't hear much about that in the suburban schools. So is this kind of the first time teachers are being exposed to these ideas of how to run a classroom?
It depends on the district, honestly, because each district is doing a different thing. But oftentimes when we go in for these trainings, this information is usually very new to teachers. This usually isn't stuff that they actually were taught growing up. And so again, like the overwhelming feeling for them is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I'm an adult and I didn't know this. And then helping them really see like, wow, this is actually something that I can do, because there is that big scary monster of CRT out there and what's being taught, but the reality is, when you teach something, hard history, in a way that is safe, it really kind of starts to alleviate. And usually what we hear from teachers is like, well, what if a kid says something that's really racist, or what if that, and then that's why we built the SEL in. That's why we do the trainings and we really model, how this can be done in the classroom. And then we go in for follow-up support as well. So each district is different, really depending on where they are. There are quite a few districts that know about restorative circles and are practicing them. But again, each one is in a different place.
Highlight too, the Monroe County BOCES have helped spearhead a project with Q's and local superintendents to teach some of this history at grades 8, 11, and 12, I think it is. And there's some really wonderful work that they've done that digs into some of this. And there's more than enough work to go around. We've collaborated, we're helping do a lot of really good work together. So asking your districts about this, our work, and is this happening here, I think is really, really, really important. So thank you, Judy, for mentioning that BOCES project.
Yep.
And I'll share a link to that in the chat so you can have a chance to learn a little more. It is voluntary, is what Judy was sharing on there, but I would let them speak for that.
And I know
a question in the Q&A about homeschooling. So you said this was open source, so that means parents who are homeschooling could get all this curriculum and use it.
Absolutely. And Kesha shared that link in the chat.
Yeah.
We're also working with a number of charter schools across the area. Recently presented to the Rochester Charter Network and have now been inundated with requests. So we will work with anyone, private or public schools. We're at Harley, Allendale, McQuaid. We're all over the place. So anywhere that wants to learn this history, we will work with them to help them figure out how to best use it for their kids. We believe it matters that kids get taught this. So great questions.
I know someone's asking if we can share a list of districts that are using the curriculum. We actually don't share that. We are working with half of the districts. And so it's really up to you to reach out to your local district and just ask if this is being taught.
So that's the main support.
We want them to own it and tell you if they're using it.
Yeah.
That really matters for transparency.
Yep.
So that's your message to us as civically engaged people, is to ask our school district if they're using this, and if not, why not?
And then I know
that's a really good,
Nicole had a question in the chat. We can't really speak to what's happening in other states because there's so much news out there about what could be, what might be, but I haven't really seen any hard evidence of actually what is happening in classrooms across the state. But we know there, again, there's a lot of politics that goes into this. And we have, we hear that here in New York State, but again, once people actually see the curriculum and take the time to experience it, usually people are just like, oh, okay, so you're not indoctrinating, you're really just asking questions. You're allowing, my child to come up with their own conclusions as well. And we were very intentional about putting SEL into each day of the unit, really making sure teachers understand SEL. We have a half-day SEL PD that we help teachers to really dig deeper into that so that they can really create a safe classroom where they can have any kind of conversation and really be able to support students' social emotional learning.
I want to really thank Reverend Cunningham for her comment in the chat, sharing some of her personal story. I think that really, really powerful what you're sharing there. So really appreciate that. One of the things about voting rights in Rochester that was interesting with migrant workers, we've been doing a lot of work around Constance Mitchell, our first Black elected official. We even have a children's book about her life. And it's pretty incredible about her being that first woman of color to be elected to public office. I think it was 61. And she was elected to the Board of Supervisors. And the first day, racial epithets were hurled at her. There was no women's bathroom at the county government office. And yet she persisted. And she and people like David Anderson, Dr. Jacob Knox, Mildred Johnson, as new migrants came north, they would actually work to try to educate, train them, and go with them to register to vote, because folks were absolutely scared about voting if they'd been coming from the South. And that's a huge part of that picture. And I just think that movement itself is such an important part of resistance and courage. So I don't know, you can't judge how people responded when it came to finding a way to resist, but we know that folks have always fought back. So thank you for that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much. This is so inspiring. It's easy to, if you read too much news, to get discouraged, and then to see what you can just do. That's very uplifting.